Hello and welcome to another episode of The World Today. A few weeks ago, France elected a new president, Emmanuel Macron, who has immediately become the great white hope of the Euro elite, which runs the continent. Even the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, who normally doesn't say too much, welcomed his victory in very strong words. One of the principal reasons for the victory of Macron was that the only candidate standing against him, Marine Le Pen, was painted in lurid colors as a fascist. She is, of course, of the extreme right, but the atmosphere in France was that if we don't vote for Macron, we are going to have fascism taking over France, etc., etc., an exaggeration and an exaggerated campaign. But nonetheless, the actual results of the first round, because in France they have two rounds, were very positive. The left-wing candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, won 19.58% of the vote, the highest vote received by a candidate of the left in France for a very long time, probably ever since the birth of the Fifth Republic. So the situation in France is not as calm as it seems. There is a volatility underneath the surface. And if Macron attempts to push down what they call reforms, but which are in reality regressions, then we could see trouble on the streets, in the plants, etc. The one point worth noting is that this last presidential election in France saw the defeat of the two principal traditional parties, the conservative right and the socialist party, who formed the extreme center of French politics for a long time. The socialists, in fact, privatizing more industries than the conservative right did in that country. So we have an interesting situation, and those who think that everything is going to settle down may be in for a few surprises. I'm very happy to have in the studio with me Olivier Tonneau, who is a lecturer in modern languages at Homerton College, Cambridge, and is actually a candidate in the forthcoming French National Assembly elections on behalf of Mélenchon's party, France Insoumise, which can't be translated literally, but means more or less France defiant. Olivier, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's discuss the presidential campaign. The way in which it has been presented, largely in the Euro media and the American media, is a victory for reason, a victory for rationality, a victory for capitalism, yes, but what a relief. Many of my French friends tell me that this was a carefully orchestrated campaign for the last 2 or 3 years to find the perfect candidate, because they knew the Socialist Party couldn't produce one, and they found one, and a lot of unpleasant things went on behind the scene with the involvement of the French state. And I know sometimes we're accused of being conspiratorial, but it's not accidental that the French satirical magazine Les Canards Enchaînés came up with the story. But how do you think they managed it so calmly and smoothly?
Well, it's hard to tell. I think, of course, I agree with what you just said. And it is very striking, of course, that Macron was Hollande's private secretary for 2 years, and then his Minister of Finances for 2 and something more years. And they managed to rebrand him as the radically new thing and a radical change in French politics. How did they manage? Actually, perhaps the answer is that they have not managed, in the sense that if you look at opinion polls, they show that Macron has a tiny base of support. There was one poll that showed that only 8% of the French population supported his program. So there is, in a sense, a very big failure here. And what you said, that it had been crucial to pit him against Le Pen, that is precisely a sign of the fact that they themselves knew that they would not manage to build consensus around this candidate, so that the only solution was to make him run against Le Pen as a sort of a repoussoir, an untouchable. And so the real story might very well be, how did they manage to build up Le Pen? And as a Mélenchon supporter, this is something I could witness firsthand for years and which infuriated me. If you want, I can give you one example of a typical strategy. So, you know, Le Pen has been stealing many elements in our program to appeal to the working class constituencies. Now, every time Mélenchon was on the news, the question was put to him, your program is the same as that of Marine Le Pen, how do you explain this? If they had been factual, journalists would have said, Le Pen has stolen your program. You just needed to compare the dates. You know, when does one measure appear on Mélenchon's program and when does it appear on Le Pen's program? They would never do this. They would accuse Mélenchon of copying Le Pen. Now, by equating constantly Le Pen and Mélenchon, what was the effect produced? On middle classes, the effect was to say, because Mélenchon is like Le Pen, he too is an untouchable, and therefore you cannot win, you cannot vote for this guy. As for the working class constituency, the message was, well, since after all Le Pen too is offering what Mélenchon is offering, then why bother vote for Mélenchon? Just keep on voting for Le Pen, you see? So you had maneuvers like this, and this is just one example that were constantly engineered so as to both credibilize Le Pen as the working class candidate and decredibilize Mélenchon as an alternative. Then there are more simple data, such as the media exposure of the different candidates. I think Macron had something like 40% of the total media coverage of all the candidates, and Le Pen also scores very highly, far higher than Mélenchon. So what can you do?
But two other points here, Olivier. One is that it's worth remembering that Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine's father, when he stood for the presidency the first time, and the positions of the party were indistinguishable from those of Macron today. Mm-hmm. The Front National were staunch supporters of the EU till Maastricht. Mm-hmm. They were staunch supporters of the free market, mm-hmm. too. So this shift has been very carefully planned by their leadership, and by Marine in particular, to try and win over some class support, which she succeeded in doing. But the more interesting thing is this, that when Jean-Marie Le Pen became the possible choice in a two-horse race in the second round, 80% of France voted Chirac. They said we did it holding our nose. This time fewer people voted for Macron, which means that there was probably the largest abstention in French electoral history, mm-hmm. which is in itself quite astonishing and shows that they might not pull this operation off.
I think that's right. I think the two big differences from 2002. The first difference is the solidification of the Front National vote. There are very good studies that show that up until 2012, the Front National vote remained volatile. People voted once in their life for the Front National. It remained a protest vote. It is under François Hollande's presidency that it actually grew roots, which shows that a betrayal from the left always has worse consequences than a betrayal from the right. Well, because from the right, it's not a betrayal. It's simple application of their program. So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is that I think in 2002, everybody perceived the qualification of Le Pen for the second round as an accident. Maybe you remember that the left was divided,
yes.
and that Jospin failed to get to the second round for something ridiculous, yes. some tenth of a point. This time, there was a sense that we had been set up, that everything had been done to lead us there, and therefore there was a very strong refusal to give in. You know, there was a sense of really being humiliated. Now, we got the scenario we wanted, you just go down and do what we told you to do. So for a lot of people on the left, that was simply impossible. And also it's so clear, this strategy of always saying, vote for anybody because we have Le Pen in front of you, that at some point it has to stop. This is also why Mélenchon did not give instructions for the second round, because there was a sense where if you give in then you're going to give in forever.
No, that was a big step forward, actually, I thought.
Well, I'm glad you say so, because not everybody thinks so.
Very important step forward for French left politics. You know, not effectively to do the bidding of the rulers of the country, which is what they want you to do, but to draw back and make an independent analysis.
Can I add something to this, though? Because
Yes.
that's very important. What is really crucial, of course, nonetheless, Mélenchon gave one instruction, which was not one vote for the National Front. This is a very important because a lot of people spin his position as if he was saying Le Pen and Macron are not the same. This is not the case because that would be an exaggeration. And the other thing that's very interesting is that if we achieved one thing during this election is that we won back votes from the National Front. And indeed, very often, I mean, I have concrete cases of this, people who did vote National Front swung towards Mélenchon. Or also people who had been abstaining for decades suddenly decided to return to politics in order to vote for Mélenchon. And these people only did this because they felt that we were offering a radical break from the system. Giving instructions would have been detrimental to this, so it was not an option.
Well, I mean, it has to be said that prior to the Mélenchon campaign, before it got going, there was a real danger that the majority of young people between the ages of 18 and 30 might vote for Le Pen.
Indeed.
She was riding high in the polls with young people. And taking that vote away from her, a vote that the extreme center parties could not win,
Absolutely.
was extremely important.
Indeed.
I mean, that was really depressing when you read that young people are actually thinking of voting for her. Now, Olivier, in France, the system is partially a presidential monarchical system. The president is the president, but he behaves like a monarch. It's a system that was effectively created by and for Charles de Gaulle. He's the only one who could fit the role.
Yes.
None of the others succeeded. At the same time, you have National Assembly elections on the basis of the first-the-past system. Is there any possibility of breaking this corrupt system?
Well, one possibility, of course, would have been to elect us, since
Yeah.
the cornerstone of our program is the convocation of a constituent assembly to move towards the Sixth Republic. I think what is very problematic as well is that normally there should theoretically be at least a balance of power between the executive power and the parliament, which holds the legislative power. But it never works because of the party system, because the government is the head of the political party which holds the majority, and all the deputies in the MPs in the National Assembly, they are career politicians, and they need to be reinvested by the party for the forthcoming election. And so there is a blackmail from party machines onto the MPs. If you don't vote the right way as the government tells you, then you will not be invested at the next presidential or the next campaign. So, for instance, under François Hollande, the crazy thing is that he passed all these liberal laws, and I'm pretty sure that deep down, in their House of Hearts, his MPs did not agree with him. None of them dared object because they are caught in this machinery. So this also, one thing that is characteristic of our movement is that candidacies for local elections are decided at the basis. For instance, I'm running because the local group of Mélenchon supporters in London asked me to be their candidate for this strange thing we have.
But explain this, that the French who are resident in Britain,
they
have a member of parliament.
Yes, that's a funny thing. So just to finish, however, if candidates for elections were elected by the base, at least that would relieve MPs from the pressure of party machineries, and that would already give some breathing space in the Fifth Republic. I think that generally the fact that political parties are the least democratic institutions in democratic societies is itself very problematic. So back to my case, yes, so this is a strange thing that was created by Nicolas Sarkozy. The French residents abroad have 11 MPs. The whole world is divided into larger zones in 11 areas. Yeah. And the idea of Sarkozy was that these, because French living abroad are generally a bit wealthier than the overall French population, he thought he would win these constituencies and they would enable him to secure a majority. It has not turned out this way. Many of them were won by the Socialist Party. So we will see if we manage to take them even further left this time.
But in France itself, Olivier, just explain to us how the National Assembly seats will be divided. There will be a vote for members of parliament on a first-past-the-post basis in the beginning.
Yes, so more or less. So the way it happens is that any party that obtains more than 12.5% of registered voters in the first round of the legislative elections can maintain itself at the second round of the legislative elections. So theoretically, you have to divide 100 registered voters by 2.5, and you see that we could have many, many candidates on the second round. Then that leads to very complex games of alliances, and sometimes to unexpected victories. So for instance, Defiant France could win a parliamentary seat with 16 or 17 or 20% if the votes are divided between, if you like, all the parties that are basically center-right. Yeah. So everything's possible. But at the end of the day, it is a first-past-the-post system in the sense that the one who wins the election sits as an MP, and that's it.
So what do you think in terms, I mean, the fact that Defiant France got 19.58% of the national vote in the presidential elections, will this automatically roll over to the National Assembly elections or not?
It's hard to tell. At the first round of the presidential election, we came first in quite a large number of major French cities. Toulouse, Marseille, many others. So in all these areas, we certainly do run a strong chance. Mélenchon himself is running in Marseille, and according to the first polls, he stands a very, very strong chance of winning. Yes. But then a lot of things can happen. So you know that there is a sort of dynamics of the winner. So strength goes to strength. So it's likely that Macron will do a bit better in the legislative elections than he did in the presidential elections. Meanwhile, we should not underestimate the conservative right.
I agree with you.
Because you said in the beginning that it was a significant fact that they had been eliminated at the first round of the presidential election. But Fillon was targeted to be a very easy winner before he got embroiled in scandals. And the big shots in his party have distanciated themselves from him quite early on. So it's possible that his party would not have been tainted by his own disgrace, and we will see if they actually perform.
Just returning to this point just for a minute, that the way in which Fillon was discredited at the last stages of the election campaign certainly made one very suspicious, because this fact about his wife taking money, which by the way is awful, but it's not uncommon in France. But the way in which it exploded and was used, one suspected involvement of the secret state, really.
I don't think so. I think what I heard from fairly reliable sources is that it's even pettier than this. It's actually a vendetta within the right. So what I heard is that, so of course I cannot... I cannot vouch for this, but apparently it's Sarkozy who took a revenge on Fillon.
It was Sarkozy's revenge. Yes. God, what dirty politics.
Yes, dirty politics, really. Yes. I'm not very prone towards conspiracies personally. I think a lot can be explained simply by the internal dynamics of the media in very crude terms. So whatever comes up that creates the buzz, they will relay in a sort of sheepish way. So
once it's out, of course, it acquires a momentum of its own. There's no doubt about that. Now let's just discuss Macron a bit. This guy is, for me, an identikit leader of an extreme center grouping. We're going to do horrible things, but we do them with a polite smile. We are very charming, we are young, we are well dressed. It's a phenomenon which is used all over the world. So we know this procedure well. But at the same time, it's important to stress that unlike Hollande, who was a complete disaster, or Valls, who was too keen to come to power and an unpleasant figure, semi-racist, if one can say, hard line. Yes. Yeah. Macron is much more intelligent than these guys, and one shouldn't underestimate that fact. I mean, the interview he gave to Mediapart, the other press interviews he's given, of course, there's a lot of bullshit in it, but nonetheless, there is a core. The guy does think.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. He's a very bizarre synthetic product. If you look at his body language, it's characteristic of Sarkozy. He moves his shoulders like Sarkozy. If you look at his very crass liberal credo, it's characteristic of Hollande. But then he stole from Mélenchon as well, because he decided to design a completely fake popular movement. Something that was supposed to be elaborated from the grassroots is completely hollow. But he sensed that this was also something that was in the air and that he had to capture. And meanwhile, he's also a populist in the vulgar sense of the term. So it's very difficult to understand what he's going on about. Yes.
He's a chameleon.
He's a chameleon, yes.
You know, that's what is very striking. The question is this. He has no party. He has this sort of en marche movement. And he's told people, if you want to become members of the National Assembly, just drop your applications in a letter.
I know people who were harassed by his movement so that they would run, because they were so short on actual candidates.
So people have applied.
Well, some people have applied, but his movement have been sending emails to people, would you consider running for the legislatives? Yes.
Olivier, the government which he set up is a national government. Socialists, conservatives.
Yes.
So it is a government which we've seen before, but now under a new president who doesn't belong to any party and can play the role of a petit Bonaparte, you know, who can maneuver these people and do what he wants with them. So how is he going to manage it? More importantly, what is he going to do?
Okay, so there is the question, of course, of what he wants to do and the question of what he's going to be able to do.
Yes.
He wants to flexibilize labor laws. He wants to fire 120,000 public servants. He wants to make a 60 billion savings. Here's something very interesting that, just as a digression. So he said he was going to do 60 billion cuts. And then he was asked, but where? And his answer reveals everything you need to know about Macron, which is that his real intellectual matrix is corporations and management. He said, I'm going to preside, I'm not going to govern, I'm going to do what the CEO does, set tasks to my team, and up to them to find a solution. So of course, the option that does not even register is that maybe the teams could come back saying, we cannot do 60 billion cuts, actually we need more investment in public services. But it's like in management, I set a task for you and you have to get it done. And so that's what he wants to do. Now, my fear is that he will get a majority to do it, if not simply from his own party, because we know that the conservative right and the socialist party are going to vote with him on most things. Yeah. And even if they made a show of disagreeing and voting against him, simply to, if you like, assert their own existence, then he would still be able to use this Article 49.3 of the Constitution, which allows the government to bypass the parliamentary vote and leaves only one option to the parliament, which is to put a defiance motion against the government and therefore bring down the government. What would happen in this case is that Macron would trigger the article, bypass the parliamentary vote, and the other parties would find a reason not to bring down the government, because deep down they agree with these measures. They know they are unpopular, so they are happy for Macron to push forward with them, and therefore they can wash their hands of the hit, if you like. So what is going to happen then? What's going to happen is that you have a program that has very low popular support, and that is most likely going to be carried forward anyway, and that's going to even widen the huge gap between the French population and the political representation. I think also the campaign and the constant idealization of Macron has not convinced people, but it has even broadened the gap between the media and the people. A gap that had stretched enormously in 2005 when the media had campaigned really shamelessly for the yes to the European Constitution.
Exactly.
Yes. So then what we are going to see is we're going to see a population in need of representation. And this is where we have to be there. And again, now Mélenchon is being constantly criticized for being of extreme intransigence in the building up of alliances towards the legislative elections. Because he's saying no compromise with anyone. Anybody can join us, but on our own term, and we're not putting water in our wine, as we say in France.
But also the experience of linking up with the Socialist Party was a disaster.
It's a disaster.
Let's face it.
Yes.
As it is a disaster for Die Linke in Germany.
Yes.
They can't bring themselves to break, and their votes go down as a result. But okay, that's the Socialist Party. What about the PCF?
So there is a complicated situation for the PCF, because if you go back to 2012, they did a very brave thing by making Mélenchon their candidate for the presidential elections, which meant running a candidate against the Socialist Party, because traditionally they are always allied with the Socialist Party. But then after 2012, they did this thing where during all the local elections, they returned to being allied with the PS. But here, there was a real thing at stake. you had, on the one hand, they had Mélenchon as their very powerful spokesperson, their only chance to have a future. But on the other hand, the PCF has money only because it still has local seats.
Headquarters,
exactly, and
property.
And these seats, it only gains in alliances with the Socialist Party. So the Communist Party was caught between two imperatives. One was continuing on the path opened by Mélenchon, but the other one was retaining the money. And to be fair to them, we were happy that they had this money because they basically bankrolled the 2012 campaign and they retained a very good militant base, great people by the way, who are tirelessly placarding and things like this. So the problem nonetheless is that by reverting to alliances with the Parti Socialiste after 2012, they completely blurred the message of the Front de Gauche, the left front, which was the previous incarnation of France Insoumise, to the point where Mélenchon had to say, look, we're going nowhere if we compromise this ourselves to this point. When Mélenchon announced his candidacy to the 2017 election, he announced it unilaterally coming out first, and he counted on the fact that the Communist Party would refuse, but the Communist Party's base would overturn the ruling of the head, and that's exactly what happened. Now, after the presidential election, the Parti Communiste is doing something that is a bit quite unpleasant. The moment the first round had been done, you had candidates of the Communist Party flooding circumscriptions with fairly ambivalent language, trying to pass themselves as the people continuing the dynamics of Mélenchon in the presidential election. Some of them even used visuals of the France Insoumise, Defiant France, or even Mélenchon's picture. Mélenchon has immediately said that there will be lawsuits against each and every candidate that will use the graphic charter of Defiant France or his poster. So there is no national agreement. And there is that does create tension between the militants, and this is what's sad, because in a way we should stick together, of course. I have a communist candidate running against me here in London. Yes, she's a woman. She seems very nice. I don't know her. She doesn't live in the UK. Nobody knows her. But nonetheless, here she is.
Olivier, what was very noticeable, which we witnessed the last time, as you said, in the Euro campaigns, is that the entire French media, especially in Paris, where the bulk of the media is based, in terms of the propaganda they put out for Macron, it could have been Kazakhstan.
Yes, yes.
I mean, there was only one view going out.
Absolutely. To my great surprise and dismay, I think the situation was even worse in publicly owned media than in privately owned media. I can give you two examples. I have a journalist from LCI, which is a big media channel. It's the same company as TF1, so really the worst of the private media, who contacted me at some point so that we do a piece on Mélenchon and Chavez that would set the record straight. I asked this guy, but are you sure? Sure, I'll do it, but are you sure you're not going to put yourself in danger? And what he said, because the real problem with the media, of course, is the working conditions of the journalists. He said, look, of course, if it was known, I would get into a lot of trouble. But I'm working on my own with my own word processing software. Nobody even looks at what I do, so probably won't even be noticed. Yes? So we wrote the piece together, and I could see how rushed he was, that he had to upload it online very quickly. It was full of spelling mistakes, so I proofread the article, reshaped it, and sent it back to him, and he said, okay, sure, and he uploaded my version. Even when there was another calumny peddled against Mélenchon about Alba, there's...
yes.
We don't need to return to the details. It was BFM TV, which is one of the worst private TV channels, that produced a very long, very well-informed refutation of the calumny. I don't know who wrote it. I don't know that guy. Meanwhile, on all the publicly owned channels, France 2, France Inter, France Info, France Culture, it was a complete disgrace, which shows that today in France, the power, or the incestuous relationships between the public sector and power are even worse than the crass power of money. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but Pujadas, who was the presenter of the biggest 8 o'clock news in France, a disaster himself, has been replaced by Anne-Sophie Lapix, who's that took a lot of work, but they found someone even worse. And she is the wife of Macron's communications director.
Wonderful. This is the way the world goes. Olivier, thanks very much
Thanks
for
to you.
being with us. Best of luck in your campaign.
Thank you.
And given what one expects to happen in France over the next few years, I hope we'll be talking again.
Well, that would be my great pleasure. Thank you for having me on.